à tous ceux qui nous rejoignent pour cette dernière journée des Rencontres du Développement Durable. Nous sommes en direct depuis Paris. Nous aurions aimé être à Nantes avec nos co-organisateurs d'Audencia pour discuter du thème de notre journée, conduire une transition juste. Pour en discuter, nous avons l'extrême honneur de recevoir le professeur Joseph Stiglitz qui a reçu le prix Nobel d'économie en 2011 et je vais faciliter cet échange en anglais. Professor, can you hear us? Are you well connected?
Yes, I can.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, let me introduce you to our public for those who do not know you already, which is probably a very small portion of our public. As I said, you are an economist. You earned the Nobel Prize of Economics in 2021, along with Professor Akerlof and Spence, and you spent the research of your life about information asymmetry, about trust, about reliability, about the way economic actors can combine their forces and rely on each other. And your research has become increasingly along the years an outreach to the world to speak about the criticism you've made about the so-called consensus of Washington, which was probably the first book I read in economics when I was a student, which was making globalization work. And of course, we do know you in France because in 2008, the French President Nicolas Sarkozy asked you to work out with Professor Fitoussi and Professor Sen about the way we could measure the economic progress in a different manner, which obviously has some sort of echo with our today's questioning regarding the fair, the just transition we need to go through. Before we get to that conversation with you, Professor, I'd like to introduce my friend Rose. Rose is one of the delegates we sent this year to the Y20 summit in Saudi Arabia. The Y20 is obviously the G20 conversation for young leaders, and Rose has a message to send and to share to our public in front of you, Professor Stiglitz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Thomas. My name is Rose Venin, and I have the honor of introducing Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. I stand before you here today not as an expert, but as a French representative to the Y20, the G20's youth engagement group. I stand before you as a young citizen, apprehensive for her future amidst a global pandemic. I stand for you apprehensive, yes, but more determined than ever to work for a just transition, a more resilient future for our planet and for all people. As we have heard throughout the past week, our societies are at a crossroads. We are facing triple crises of people's health, climate, and inequality, and youth are in the front lines. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed our vulnerabilities, exacerbated gender, racial, and digital inequalities, shown the limits of our extractive socio-economic systems. But today, amidst the prevailing uncertainty, we, Y20 delegates, want to carry a message of active hope. We do not know how to recover the lives of the million dead, nor how to reconstruct the rainforests or the Arctic ice. We do know how to transform our current models for a desirable future, one in which every youth can realize their hopes. Now is the time to rethink, redistribute, and redesign. For this, we need decisive political action. 5 years after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and of the Paris Agreement, we, the French delegate to the Y20, are demanding for G20 governments for decisive action on climate, equity, and international solidarity. Concretely, this translates into 3 asks. First, a shift to low-carbon circular economies, ending subsidies to fossil fuels and redirecting these subsidies to just transition funds. Second, leaving no young person behind. As our societies transition towards greener economies, governments must build fair and accessible job markets. By upskilling economically marginalized youth and incentivizing businesses to employ us in low-carbon jobs. Third, international cooperation and solidarity. $2.6 trillion are needed to achieve the SDGs in low-income and emerging markets. G20 governments must deliver by 2030 on the 0.7% official development assistance targets. To all of you watching, I can say with confidence that we, youth, stand ready to act on these asks. Better, that we are already acting. We're marching, we're innovating, and we are paving the way forward. But we cannot do this alone. We need everyone involved, starting with our political leaders. Our next speaker will further discuss these and other political steps towards a just transition, a core theme of his research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Well, Professor, you hear that French youngsters are very active in defending the agenda of the 2030 agenda itself. And you are also very active in the US. The youngsters from the US are as active as my French fellow here, Rose. But your country is in a position that sounds to us Europeans in a very, very different shape from what we expect from the free world leadership. Can you tell us a bit more on how we got stuck to that level of political gamble in the US? We could expect from the White House 5 years after the Paris Climate Agreement and 5 years after the SDG adoption at the UN General Assembly some sort of leadership, but the US, which chairs the G7 this year, is absolutely absent from dealing with this crisis at the international level. How do you assess that?
Well, hopefully in 4 weeks, we will embark on a different course. We have an election in 4 weeks. I view the last 4 years as an aberration in American leadership. And I think Rose has done a fantastic job of delineating 3 of the key issues: climate, equity, and international solidarity. And I think the last is particularly important in the context of the pandemic that we are facing. And there are many aspects of this that I could talk about.
Sure.
But let me just mention a couple that relate particularly to the pandemic that we are going through right now. And I think beginning in January, when hopefully we'll have a new president, you'll see a restoration of American leadership in each of these 3 areas. The first is knowledge is a global public good. And never before have scientists been cooperating to the extent that they have in trying to find out ways of attacking COVID-19, discovering what it is that's causing the disease, developing therapeutics, developing vaccines. There is really enormous solidarity among the scientific community. Unfortunately, there's not that same kind of solidarity among countries or even among our drug companies, our pharmaceutical companies. Intellectual property, knowledge has to be shared. Costa Rica has led the world. A small little country is showing the kind of international leadership that you would have expected from the United States in saying that knowledge has to be shared. And I think that suggests more broadly, we need to have a new intellectual property regime to govern knowledge so that we can use global knowledge for the benefit of everybody around the world.
We will zoom on that very specific of international solidarity you just mentioned, because the French citizens strongly support this idea of reinforcing international solidarity. But let me step back a bit before we get to that point. The COVID-19 crisis has put us in a very specific situation where we stand as we had increasingly and skyrocketing levels of inequality before entering the crisis. This super high level of inequalities has exploded throughout the crisis because of the economic consequences, people getting back to poverty, people losing their jobs, losing their rents. And that was the very purpose of the 2030 agenda. The SDGs were meant to deal with inequalities, with social discrepancies, and the global keepers, those who watch us in dealing with this, with the SDGs, say we have lost 20 years in achieving the SDGs. In the US, this is a very specific case, and the SDG number 10, which is about inequality, which obviously echoes the entire research you made throughout your life, is the indicator that highlights how divisive this crisis is in your country. Could you let us know how you assess that, and how what kind of policy you would see as a dealer to address that problem?
Well, let me say first, it was not easy to get that equality metric goal within the SDGs. There was actually opposition, including from the United States and the UK. And my interpretation was that the United States and the UK were so embarrassed about how poorly they were doing that they didn't want people to talk about it. Well, as you pointed out, this virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after people, particularly with poor health conditions, and that's correlated with those with low income. And that's especially the case in a country like the United States, which is doesn't recognize the right of access to health care as a basic human right. And so, as you pointed out, it is not only going after those who have low income and low health, it is causing greater inequalities in income because those at the bottom are experiencing greater losses of jobs and greater health consequences. The disease is attacking them disproportionately. So I think in that sense is it exposed and aggravated these underlying inequities in our economic system. Again, I hope that beginning with the new administration in January, this agenda of dealing with these inequities will be at the top of the new administration's plans.
But on the shorter term, before we get to that point of change, maybe, or maybe not, we don't know at this stage, there are many steps that we look at. And if we remember that last year when France was chairing the G7 summit, the top agenda was meant to deal with inequalities. And we have adopted within G7 nations numerous measures to address international discrepancies between the North and the Global South, to address inequalities between men and women, etc., etc. And this year, the G7 did not even meet to address the crisis. And the G20 summit is supposed to convene right before the elections, but we cannot expect anything out of the G20 in that context of political instability. So, do you hope anything from that meeting? How could they coordinate fiscal, monetary measures to make sure that this crisis is dealt with a sense of equality?
Well, let me say, I don't expect much out of that. You can't get strong results if the United States is not cooperating, and it's not cooperating. But let me emphasize, there are some important tools, and again, hopeful about the outcome of the election. These tools need to be used. For instance, one of the tools with instruments within the IMF is the issuance of what are called special drawing rights. And the head of the IMF has called for an issuance of $500 billion of these special drawing rights. It's like money that can be given to different countries. Yeah. It is allocated according to what they call the quotas, but a number of European countries have committed themselves to lend or donate their special drawing rights to developing countries and emerging markets. And this would make an enormous difference.
Let me highlight the fact that within G20 nations, we, on the average, have spent 22% of GDP to address the crisis, while in the South, in the global South, it was 3% of GDP because of lack of resources. So this instrument that is front-run by the IMF, which you have been criticizing for a long period of your time, is now the convenient tool to address the lack of resources in the global South, right?
Very much so. And interestingly, the IMF has changed dramatically and is at the leadership, the forefront of trying to get money to the emerging markets and developing countries. Interestingly, in the U.S. Congress, there are the proposals by Democratic members, but it's bipartisan, for a $2 trillion issuance of special drawing rights. And again, I am very hopeful with the new administration, if we have that in January, what we have won't be limited to the $500 billion that we could do without going back to the parliaments, but that we would have leadership from America for all the parliaments around the world to endorse this $2 trillion issuance of special drawing rights. So important, so needed at this moment, as such a strong demonstration of international solidarity.
Professor, let me ask you that. I have heard correctly that you're saying that a Democratic Senate could actually multiply by 4 the figures that the IMF is ready to put into the financial system to support the global South?
That's right. There's legislation already there. Wow. And strongly supported by a large number of senators and members of the House of Representatives. And I am hopeful that will be enacted. The $500 billion can be done just by the approval of the Secretary of Treasury. And for a reason that none of us can understand, he has withheld that approval. And because of the ability of the U.S. to essentially veto key decisions of the IMF, the $500 billion has not gone forward.
Yeah, well, that's increased. That's amazing, and let me point out to those who hear us and maybe need some refresher on the job you've done to explain what happens in the global economy. Within the Washington institutions, there is a sort of triangle between the World Bank, the IMF, and the White House, because the White House has a sort of veto power within these two international institutions. Because of the resources that the U.S. is putting into these global financial institutions, and that leads to the next the next question I have for you. What this discussion is about hope. Who can we trust to lead the change, to lead the crisis management we need to cope with not only the pandemic but also with the climate crisis that comes next? And we often hear here in France that it's not too bad if the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate-related issues, because at a lower level, the federated states, Michigan, California, Arkansas, the governors can make a change and get back into the game. Is that something you would assess correctly from a U.S. point of view, or is it only a dreamer of French philosophers?
No. Actually, our major states, New York and California, many states throughout the country, are not only living up to the plans that were put forward in Paris, but exceeding them. Moreover, many companies, multinationals, realize their international obligations, and they too are fulfilling their obligations. But it is absolutely essential to get the federal government on board. We need to go beyond what was agreed to in Paris if we're going to really address climate change. The United States has been hit very badly this year by climate change and the fires in California and Oregon and Washington, the floods in Iowa, the hurricanes. We've been hit very badly. And so Americans know that climate change is real. And we want to go beyond what was agreed in Paris in the way that Europe has gone beyond it. In your recovery package, you're making a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's right. And I think that's something that we would like to do. And I feel confident we will do if we have a new administration.
And Professor, let me take it from here, because I've read you for years now. I've read your criticism about the way the European Union has dealt with the financial crisis in 2008 and the economic crisis we've been going through in the aftermath of that financial instability, especially in dealing with the euro system. You were very critical on those aspects. And now the EU has completely redesigned, reprogrammed its approach to macroeconomics with this plan Next Generation EU, which brings together debt from the financial market for one single actor, which is the Union, which was your call for action for years. So how do you assess the progress that Europe has made to achieve this objective of carbon neutrality by 2050?
Oh, I think it's enormous progress. And I think the framework of using the funds that are necessary to help Europe recover from the pandemic to create a post-pandemic economy that corresponds to the vision that Europe wants, a greener economy, is absolutely essential. So I have enormous respect for what Europe has done. But I have to also say that it should be larger. More of it should be in the form of grants rather than loans. And it's important that it not be accompanied by excessive conditionality, just that the money has to be green and has to go for an equitable recovery. But the kinds of conditions associated with austerity that were part of the past program, they should not be part of this kind of recovery program.
Yeah, I see that we get back to the very point of start of our discussion, which is about trust. And let me get to the very last question about it. We've been speaking about the US and whether we can hope a change in the administration. We've been speaking about European recovery as a lead by example program, but there is another player on a global stage that needs us to pay attention for, which is China. And last week at the UN General Assembly, the Chinese president has announced that they would aim at carbon neutrality by 2060. It has been applauded as a major step towards achieving the Paris Climate Agreement. But here I have two questions. As a US citizen, and obviously one of the most important thought leader in the US, do you think that this will help the US reconnecting with China after the election? Or do you believe that even if it's Joe Biden winning the presidential election, it will be hard to reconnect with China? And second question about that, which is maybe the most important one, don't you fear that this climate commitment is actually a way to politicize its very aggressive foreign policy that would put us in the position of choosing between liberty and climate?
Well, I think what it illustrates is that we have to cooperate with countries that we may not agree with, their values, their economic or political system. We live in one planet, and we have to fight climate change. We have to fight pandemic. We have to do these things together. There's an analogy sometimes put. If you were on the Titanic and the Titanic goes down, and you're in a rowboat, in a lifeboat, trying to save yourself, there may be people in that boat that you may not like, you may not respect, but you need first to get to safety. So we have to cooperate. That's an aspect of solidarity that we have to have. But at the same time, we have to be vocal, I believe, about our values, about democracy, about human rights. And we see those values being offended, being countries doing things that are the antithesis of that, suppressing democracy or suppressing human rights. We have to speak out. And there will be anger. And of course, they will point out that we don't recognize, we don't treat parts of our population in the way we should, and that's true. But at least we are open about it, and we say we will be making amends. We have not recognized the economic rights of large parts of our population. We haven't done what we should be doing about climate. So there are many things we have to repair, but the principles of human rights and the principles of democracy have to be things to which we subscribe and not given an inch.
So you don't fear us from having to trade with China between protecting Uyghurs and dealing with the climate crisis?
No, I think we have to find ways of saying we will work together on climate change, we will work together on pandemics, but we will not be silent on issues of the treatment of the Uyghurs or on issues of democracy in Hong Kong.
All right, Professor. Well, let me ask you one very last question. We are ahead of the G20 summit, as I told you, and every year, right before the G20 summit, there is this so-called Y20 summit I had the honor to create and chair 10 years ago, which is the youth group of the G20. If you had to advise those young leaders, as Rose earlier, on what they should do or how they should do it right before getting to the G20 leaders and put forward their own agenda, what would it be? It's a question about your own experience of international leadership.
Well, I think the kind of agenda that Rose talked about was excellent, but I would also encourage the young leaders to think concretely about specifics, about the issuance of a statement, a consensus against vaccine nativism, for instance, the sharing of global knowledge, especially in the context of the pandemic, of rethinking intellectual property rights, of an issuance of SDRs, of a reform in the international debt system, so we have a mechanism for restructuring sovereign debts. Many countries are going to be facing debt crises in the coming years. So I think it's important that they both articulate the broader vision and the commitment to that broader vision, but also put forward a concrete agenda that puts the leaders on the spot. The leaders have a tendency to use platitudes. to say things like, we will use all available instruments, but then they don't use all available instruments. They don't use the SDRs to the extent that they could or should. So I would like these young people to not only articulate a vision and a set of shared commitments, but a concrete agenda by which that vision can be achieved.
I guess that they will be ready for that by the next 2 weeks. So, Professor, thank you for spending this masterclass with us. It was an honor to host you on this very special day of the anniversary of not only the 5th anniversary of the SDGs, of course, but also the 75th anniversary of the very system of the UN. We've had an extensive discussion over global governance and the way the economy can be cooperative and well managed. I'd like to thank the business school that has co-organized with the Open Diplomacy Institute this masterclass, which is Audencia. And I'd like to thank you, Professor. Have a good day. I don't know what exact hours it is in the US, but enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Merci à tous ceux qui nous ont suivis pour cette masterclass exceptionnelle avec le professeur Joseph Stiglitz. On continue cet après-midi évidemment pour approfondir nos réflexions après les questions d'égalité femmes-hommes, après les questions de solidarité internationale. La prochaine table ronde portera sur les questions de justice territoriale dans cette logique de conduire une transition juste autour de cette dernière journée des rencontres du développement durable co-organisée avec Audencia. À tout de suite.